There comes a time in every tech YouTuber's journey when they're compelled to make a real-time chat application. This is my real-time chat application. Hi, this is TomDoesTech. I'm Tom, and welcome to the real-time chat application with React.js, Node.js, and Socket.io video. In this video, we're going to be building a real-time chat application. So what technologies are we going to be using? We're going to be using Node.js. We're going to use React, and we're going to be using React hooks and the context API. We're going to be using TypeScript for the backend and front end. By watching the full video, you'll learn how sockets work on both the server and the client. You'll learn how to set up Socket.io correctly in React, which a lot of tutorials won't show you. And you'll learn how to organize the code for maintainability. So let's take a look at what it is that we're going to be building. So you can see on the left here, I have one instance of the chat application, and on the right, I have another instance. And the left is going to be called left, and the right is going to be called right. So we can start, and we can start on both sides. On the left, we'll create a new room, and we'll call this left's room. And you can see the room gets created on both sides, and the left automatically joins the room. We can join the room on the right, and the right can send a message that says, "Hello, I'm from the right." Send the message, and you can see it comes up on both sides. And if we say, "Hi, I'm from the left," we can send a message, and the message gets sent to both sides. If we don't have the tab in focus, we open a new tab here, and we send a message that says, "Please subscribe. I want to get to 1K subs, but I'm only at 400. Sad face." We'll send this message. And you can see up here that the tab name has changed to new message, and we can click that tab. And when it gets focused again, it will change back to chat app. And while we're on this, please subscribe. I'm only at 400 subscribers at the moment, which is fantastic, but I really want to get to 1,000 subscribers. So please make sure you hit that subscribe button now and like this video. So I'm back in VS Code, and we'll take a look at the code that we're going to be writing. So you can see here we're using an Express server, and we're going to use create server from HTTP. And we're using this server module from Socket.io. And we're also going to be using this config module. We're setting some options here from config. We're going to initialize our Express server. And then we're going to initialize a server from the HTTP module. And we're going to pass our Express server into that function. We're initializing our Socket.io server with some CORS options. And we have a single endpoint here for making sure our server is up and running. And then we're going to listen on our host and our port and print out some logs. If we go into this socket function, this is where the magic happens on the server. So we have this events object here, which is going to contain all the constants for events that we're going to listen to and emit. And events in the client are events that we're going to listen to from the client. And events in the server are events that the server is going to emit to the client. So we're listening for a connection event, and then we have several other events that we're going to listen for and emit. So we're going to listen when a user creates a room, when a user sends a message to a room, and when a user joins a room. And then in our client, we have a index page here, and our index page is going to render a box to enter a username, and then it's going to render our rooms container and a message container. So if we have a look at our rooms container, you can see that we're going to have input to create a room, and then we're going to output all the buttons to join the current rooms. And then our messages container is going to list all the messages, and it's going to have a text area where you can create a message. And for the styling, we're using CSS modules because this is built into Next.js. If you're using a React component library, please let me know. I've been wondering what everybody is using. So let's get started building this real-time chat application. So I'm here in VS Code in an empty directory, and we're going to make a folder for our server and one for a client. If you're following along with this tutorial, you can turn it into whatever you like. There's lots of different flavors that chat applications come in. If you do turn it into something else, please let me know in the comments below. I'd really love to see that. So we're going to make a new folder, and we're going to call this server. And in the root directory, we're going to npx create next app for our client, and we're just going to call that client. So while this next app is initializing, we can come and cd into our server directory, and we can type yarn in it, and this will initialize a new Node application. And just press enter for all these, and we can initialize TypeScript as well. One thing to note about this is the client does not use any React frameworks. I'm just using CSS modules. So we have our package initialized and we have TypeScript initialized. So let's make a new directory and call that source. We can open it up and have a look what's in here. So in our source directory, we can make a new app.ts. And we just want to get this app running. So we can say console.log. This is from app. And we need to get this running. So we're going to use Nodemon for that. So I have this Nodemon predefined that I usually just copy and paste from project to project. We can execute Nodemon by saying Nodemon, and we'll point to the configuration file. And we'll say the application you want to run is in source/app.ts. And so we can run this by typing yarn dev. And you can see that we have some dependencies that we need to install. So let's go ahead and then just install those dependencies. So we're going to add types for Express, types for Node. We're going to add TS Node, TypeScript, types for config, and types for Pinot. And we're going to install those as dev dependencies. And we can install some more dependencies while we're here. So we're going to install Express, config, socket.io, Pinot, and Pinot is a logger, Day.js, so we're going to use that to format logs. So we're going to use Day.js to format the time in our logs. We're going to use Pinot Pretty. So we also need to install some dependencies on our client. So we can add socket.io client. And because we're going to make this a TypeScript application, we need to install TypeScript and types/React as development. So we'll come into our pages and we can delete this API folder. And we can change index to index.tsx. And we can change _app to _app.tsx. So cd into the client and type yarn dev. And you can see our application has started on port 3000. And it's detected that we're using TypeScript, so it's going to create a tsconfig file for us. So that's all we need to do for our client for now. So let's come back into our server and we can try yarn dev again. And you can see this is from our app, so this is working correctly. So let's come and build out the bones for our backend. So we need to import Express from Express. We need to import create server from HTTP. We need to import server from socket.io. And we need to import cause from our cause module. And we need to import config from config. Config module just allows you to create JSON files for each environment and then set the config in those files. So we're just going to get the port and the host from our config. So we say const port equals config.get, and this is going to be a number. And if we command or control click into get, you can see here that it takes a generic. So we're going to tell it that whatever you're getting here is going to be a number. And we're going to get port, and we're going to do the same thing with host. So this is not going to work at the moment, so we need to set up a config folder. So create a new folder in this server's root directory called config. In config, we're going to create a new file called default.ts. And in default, we're going to export a default object, and we're going to say cause origin is equal to localhost port 3000. So when you're in development or in production, you want to change this variable here to be whatever your client's domain is. We're going to run this on port 4000 and our host is just going to be localhost. We're going to say const app equals express. We're going to execute that function. We can say const HTTP server equals create server. And we're going to pass our app into create server. Move this default import. We can say const io equals new server, and remember server comes from socket.io. It's going to take our HTTP server as the first argument, and the second argument is going to be an object, and we need to set our cause properties up in. So the origin is going to be our cause origin, and so we need to get cause origin from our config. So we can copy this line here, come into config, copy that there, and paste this into here. And we can paste that there. And we're going to say credentials is equal to true. So we're just going to set up one endpoint here that is going to be the root domain. So we can say app.get, and this is just so we can check that our API is up and healthy. And this is going to be a express request. The first argument is the request. The second is the response, and we're not going to use the request object, so we can just put an underscore here. And we can say res.send, and we're going to send a string that just says server is up. So now we need to make our server listen. So we can say HTTP server.listen, and the first argument is going to be our port. The second argument is going to be our host. You don't need to specify the host here, but I think it's good practice because if you're going to deploy this with Docker, you're going to want to set the host to 0.0.0. And so it's nice to have it set here. So then we can use console.log, and we can say server is listening. So let's try this again, and we can say yarn dev. So we have server is listening here. So if we go to http/localhost and then port 4000, we should get this server is up. So let's do that now. And we get our server is up. Awesome. So while we're here, let's set up our logger because we don't want to be using console log. So let's create a new folder in our source directory called utils. And in our utils directory, we're going to create a new file called logger.ts. And inside logger, we're going to import logger from Pino. And then we're going to import day.js from day.js. And we're just going to say const log equals logger. And we're going to put some arguments in here. So we're going to say pretty print is true. And we're going to say base. And we're going to say PID is false. So this won't print the process ID. And then we're just going to format the timestamp. So we can pass an argument here. And we're just going to print the current time. And we're going to format that with day.js. So we can put a comma here. And we can put some quotes that say time. We'll put a full colon, we'll put some more quotes, and we'll say day.js. We'll execute that. We'll say .format. And now we should be able to export this log as default. Let's come back into our app and we can import our new logger. And then when our server is listening, we can say logger.info. Server is listening. And of course, we need some rocket ship emojis here. So we'll put one at the start and one at the end. I'm not sure if your application will start without rocket ship emojis. Somebody has to let me know in the comments below. And you can see here we get our log. So this is the timestamp that we formatted. You can format that however you like. And then we get the actual message here and the log level here. So if we want to print what version of the application is running, we can import the version from package.json. So we go back 2 directories and we'll say package.json. And TypeScript is going to complain here because it doesn't know that we can import JSON files. So it says here, please use a resolve JSON module. So we'll come into our tsconfig and we'll just say resolve JSON module is true. And then we'll be able to use our version. So we'll say server is up and running version, and we'll put our version here. Server is listening. Say server version. We'll pass our version in here, and we need to change these to template strings. And we have server version 1.0.0 is listening. And we will want to put another log in here that tells us where we can find the server. So we'll say HTTP, and then we'll put our host in here. We need another slash, and then the port. So we have this IO object here. So we want to create a new file called socket.ts. And socket is just going to be a function called socket. And that's going to take one argument called IO. And then IO is going to be a type of server, which comes from our socket IO package. And I'm not getting any helpful hints here, so I can import it from the top. And we can export our function as default. And we need to pass our function body here. And we can also import our logger. And we're just going to say logger.info. Sockets enabled. So let's pass one event in here. We'll say io.on. And the event that we're going to listen to is connection. And we're just going to say logger.info. And this connection is going to take a socket argument, and that's going to be of type socket. We'll say user connected. And then we'll just say what their ID is. So we can say socket.id. And instead of hard coding this string here, let's create our events object. So we'll say const events. And then we'll say that this is going to be a client event. So we're just going to have connection as a root level event. And then instead of hard coding this here, we can say events.connection. Let's come back over to our user interface, and we're going to get a user to connect to this socket IO and make sure everything is running correctly. So in the client's root directory, let's make a new folder called context. And in context, we're just going to create a new file called socket.context.ts. So that's going to be .tsx. I'm going to import IO from socket IO client. And we need to set up some configuration. So we can create a new folder in here called config. And in config, we're just going to have a default.ts. And we need to set up one piece of config in here, and this is going to be, so we need to set up one piece of config in here, and this is going to be our socket URL. So we're going to try get it from our process.environment variables. Otherwise, we're just going to set it to localhost port 4000, which is our servers directory. So we can import that from here in here. So we're going to create a new function called sockets provider. And that's just going to take some props, and we're just going to type that as any. And up here, we're going to say const socket context equals create context. And this is going to come from React. And we're not going to pass any arguments in here. And so in our socket provider, we're just going to say return socket context dot provider. And we can wrap this. And we can just return our props. So props is going to include children. And so that's going to return in here. And so we need to pass a value property in here. The value is just going to be equal to an empty object from now. And let's just make this an empty object as well to satisfy TypeScript. Okay, so we need to export our sockets provider. So we can export that as default. And then we need to export a way to use the socket provider. So we can export const, and we'll call this use sockets. And this equals a function. And the function is going to return use context. And the context we're going to use is our socket context. So if this is confusing, that's okay. You probably should read the context documentation on the React documentation website. So if this is confusing, that's okay. It took me a while to understand how context works, but basically you're going to wrap your root element in this provider. And then in all your components, you're going to call use socket. So we're going to say const, and then this is going to return a list of arguments. And we're going to say equals use socket. And then in here, we're going to be able to say like we want sockets, we want our room ID, etc. And it just means that we don't have to pass props around and drill props through different components. So this is all set up for now. So the last thing in here to do for now is to set up our socket. So we can say const socket equals IO. And then IO is going to take our socket URL. And we want to initialize our socket context with our socket property. And value is just going to take our socket as well. So in our index page, so in our app.ts, we can import our socket provider. And then we can wrap our component in socket provider. And this means that our sockets will be available from everywhere. So if we come into app, we can remove the contents of this here. And we can return a div that just says hi for now. And we can import sockets. And we can import our use socket from our sockets context. And so in here, we can say equals sockets. And then this can just be socket.id. So this should just print our socket ID to the page. So we need to fix this here so we can make this a self-closing component. And we just need to spread the props in this component. So if we come back to our user interface, we should see a log in our server that says socket connected, and we should see an ID on the user interface. So if we come to localhost port 3000, you can see here that we get a socket ID. And then if we come over to our server, we don't see a socket connected, and that is because we haven't initialized sockets. So let's do that here. So we can import sockets, import sockets from socket. And then once our server has started, we can just say socket, and we'll pass our IO in as the. Come over to our client, refresh again. Come over to our client, you can see we have our socket ID, and you can see here we have user connected and then their socket ID. So let's go build out the skeleton for our application. Let's go build out the skeleton for our front end. So we'll create a new folder called containers. And our containers is going to have our rooms.tsx, and this is essentially our sidebar. And then we're going to have a new folder called messages.tsx. So let's just say function messages container. And then in here, we can just return, and we can export our messages container as default. And we can do the same in rooms. So you can just copy and paste this. And where it says messages, we can change all occurrences and change this to rooms. And in index, we can import those two containers. And we can remove this for now. Make this equal a div. And we're going to render our rooms container. And we're also going to render our messages container. Look at the UI and we can see we have rooms. And so we don't want to show these if the user doesn't have a username set. So let's do that first. So we're going to store all state in this use sockets context. We can come into here and we can create some new state called username is equal to use state, which is going to be an empty string, and we can call this username. And we can create one called set username. And we can pass these down into bits. And we want to type this so we know when we're using it that we're importing the right thing, and we get some helpful. So let's create a new interface and we'll call this context. And on here so far we have socket. And this is going to be equal to socket. So on here so far we have socket, and this is going to be, and this is going to have a type of socket. We can get this from socket.io. So next to IO, we can do a named import for socket. We're going to have a username, which can be faulty, and that's going to be a string. Then we're going to have set username, and this is going to be a function. So we can pass our context interface into our create context as a generic. And in here, it's going to tell us that we're expecting set username. So in here, we can just say set username is equal to this function, and then we're going to reassign this down below, which we've already done. Close all my other windows. Have socket, and we have username, and we have set username. I'm going to create a new function called handle set username, and I'm going to create a reference called username ref, and that's going to be equal to useRef, and it's just going to take null for now. We're going to say const value equals username ref dot current value. And then we can just say if not value. So if they've just submitted an empty text box, then we can just return. Otherwise, we're going to call set username, and that's going to have a value of value. And so we want to set this username in local storage as well, because every time the person enters their username, they don't want to have to re-enter it into the box. So we can say local storage.setItem, and we'll call that username. And this is just going to be equal to our value. We'll say if not username, then we want to render this component. We're going to render a div. Inside the div, we're going to render an input. We're just going to add a placeholder here called username. And we're going to add our ref as username ref. Then we can have a button. And this button is just going to have a label of start. A component, it's just a button. And on click is going to be our handle set username function. And you can see that we have our username. Let's open up local storage. And we can set our username as Tom. And we should expect to see this box disappear and our username gets set in local storage. So click start, the box disappears and our username gets set in local storage. So let's only render these if the username is present. So we can say username and end, and then we're going to wrap this in a fragment. And then we can pass these two properties like this. So if we refresh again, we should see this disappear and our rooms and messages appear. Perfect. So before we go any further, let's just wrap these in some divs so we can style these easily later on. So I'm going to wrap the username in a div called username wrapper. And I'm also going to add a inner div here. So I'm going to create a new div. So I'm just going to copy that div and I'm going to call this username inner. And I'm going to create another div here. We can close that div. And I'm going to call this one container. So let's go implement our rooms. So our rooms handler does two things. It allows us to create a new room and it allows us to join a room. So let's create our input for joining a room first. So let's create our input for creating a room first. So let's wrap this in a nav. And we're going to import useSocket. We're going to need our sockets here, and we're going to need a room ID. And we're going to need a list of rooms. So let's go add those to our sockets. So room ID is going to be an optional string. And rooms at the moment is just going to be array of any. So our default for rooms is just going to be an empty object. So let's just say this is an object. And we need to create a new date object for this. So we can say room and set room ID. So we can do the same with rooms. We can say set rooms. And rooms is going to be an array. And room ID is going to be a string. So let's pass these into context. So we're going to pass our rooms in and we're going to pass our room ID. So we can come back to rooms and we have these properties here now. So I'm going to render a div, and inside that div, I'm going to have an input for the room name. I'm going to put a placeholder in here. It just says room name. I'm going to create a new reference that says new room ref is equal to ref, and ref is going to be null. And then I'm going to pass ref into our new room name. Then I'm going to create a button here. And our button is going to say create room. And so we need a handler for our creating a room. So handle create room. And when we click create room, we're going to execute this function. So inside the handle create room, we want to first get the room name. And then we want to emit an event that says a new room has created. So we're going to say emit room created event. And then we want to set the room name input back to an empty string. So to get the room name, we can say const room name is equal to room name ref. So new room ref dot current dot value, or it's going to be an empty string. And so if it is an empty string, we just want to return. So we can say if not, and we'll cast it to a string just to be safe. Room name dot trim. So we don't want any empty spaces. Then we're just going to return. So here we can emit an event. And so we have our socket object here. So we can say socket.emit. And we can say events.client.create room. So we need to create this events object. So come into config and we'll create a new file in config called events.ts. And we'll go look in our server sockets and we can see we have this events here. So we can say client, and then this is going to be create room. And then it's just going to be equal to its string. So we can copy this events and we can pass it into our client events object, and we can just export this as default. And now when we come back into our room, we can hopefully get VS Code to import this for us. So VS Code imported that for us because we've named the constant and then exported as default. So if we just export default our object here, and we can remove this. And then if we remove our events import here, and then we type events here, you can see that we don't get any import suggestions for events. So if we name this constant and then export as default, we get those handy import helpers. So this is events, not event. And then once so emit takes two arguments. It takes the name of the emit event, and it takes whatever arguments you want to pass to the server. So in this case, we're just going to pass in the room name. And then we're going to set the room name in the input back to an empty string. So we can say new room ref dot current dot value is just equal to an empty string. So let's go implement this create room on this server. I'm going to split my window here so I can see both the client and the server at once. And inside our connection, I'm just going to say socket.on, and we can get our events.client.create room. And then this is going to take a callback, and whatever arguments we passed in here is going to be available in the .on callback. So in here, we have our room name. And let's just console log this for now. And we should go to our client and double check that when we click create room, it will set the input back to an empty string, and this room name will get printed in the server. So let's clear these terminals. Come back to our client. We can set a username, and we're going to set a room name. So test room name, click create room. And we can see in the server, we have our room name. So in this create room event on the server, we're going to do a few things. We're going to create a room ID. We're going to add a new room to the rooms object. We're going to join the room. We're going to broadcast an event saying there is a new room. So this will appear on the sidebar for all the other users so they can join that room. We're going to emit an event back to the user so they have access to the new room as well. So broadcast will emit to everybody except the person who created this event. We need to send an event back to them as well. So we're going to emit back to the room creator with all the rooms. And then we're also going to emit an event back to the room creator saying they have joined a room, and that's going to be this. So let's implement this stuff here. So I'm going to import NanoID to create the room ID. Import NanoID from NanoID. I think we may need to npm install this. So I'm going to yarn add NanoID. And we may also need to install some type definitions for NanoID. I don't think we do. So we could say const room ID equals NanoID. And this is just going to make a new string for us. Then we need to create a rooms object. So you can use an array here if you like. I just find objects easier to work with when you're trying to get properties from the object, because you can get the property by the key. Otherwise you need to use a filter or a find method. So we can say rooms, and then we're going to make the key of the room ID. And we can add a new object here. And we can say the room name is equal to room. So TypeScript is complaining here, and it's telling us that this has a type of any. So we need to type out our room, and we can do that now. So it's going to be a record, and the key is going to be a string. So this key here is our room ID. And then it's going to have an object as the body, and it's going to have a name property, and the name is going to be a string. And you can see TypeScript is happy now. So we've created our room ID, add a new room to the object. Now we need to do socket.join room ID, and we've already typed that out here. The next thing to do is to broadcast an event. So we can say socket.broadcast.emit. I'm going to emit a new event here, and this event is going to be from the server. So we'll create a new property on our events called server. And we're just going to call this property rooms. And it's just going to be equal to the string room. So we'll say events.server.rooms. And the payload for this is just going to be our rooms payload. You don't have to do this if you don't want to. You can just hardcode this as rooms. But I can guarantee you, if you do that with enough events, you're going to start making mistakes, and then you're going to get yourself very confused. I find this much easier. And by looking at this event, anywhere you see it, you can see, well, this comes from the server, and this is what it does. So we can say socket.emit, and we can say events.server.rooms. And again, this is going to be our rooms. And we're going to have another event here, and this is just going to be joined room. And the payload is going to be, again, that same string. So we can copy this event down here, events.server.joinedRoom, and we're going to pass our room ID into the argument. So that is our server part done. Let's go into the client, and we can handle when a user has joined a room. So inside use sockets, we want to listen to this rooms event. And then we want to populate this rooms array here. So because rooms has a structure of an object, you can see here the default is just an empty object. We can make this an empty object as well. And inside here, we can say socket.on. And we want to copy our sockets object again. And so we want to copy our events object again. We can come into events here and we can just replace it. So we can say events.server.rooms. And again, this is going to take a callback. And we're going to get our rooms in here. And let's just call this value so we don't get confused with this rooms property here. And we can just call set rooms. And we're going to pass our value into here. So we should now see our rooms object got populated. So let's come back to rooms. And we can see we have rooms here. So inside our navigation, let's say object.keys. And we're going to map through those keys. Map is going to take a callback, and the property that we get is going to be key. And so let's just return a div for now. And we're going to pass in the key. And we also need a key on here. So this key is going to be the room ID. Let's start our server back up. So when we click create room, we should see a list of rooms and our room should appear in that list. So new room. And you can see here, this is our new room ID. So we can get the room name by saying rooms, and this is going to be key.name. So we can see we have new room here. So we say another room. Create that, and we have another room. So let's handle this joined room event. So again, come back into our sockets. And so you'll notice a little pattern here. All the events from the server, we're going to listen for those in our sockets, and we're going to then update some sort of state property. And then in all of our other components, we can use that state property. And so we don't need to listen for certain events in each component. So we can say socket.on events.server.joined room. Again, this takes a callback. And this is going to be a room ID. Again, let's just call it value so we don't get confused with this room ID. And we can call set room ID is going to be equal to our value. Let's also, while we're here, create a new property for messages. And this is getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but what we want to do when we join a new room is we just want to set messages to an empty string. Otherwise, the messages that are displayed are going to be from a different room. And in our messages, we're going to use socket again. We're going to say const object equals use socket. And we're going to need our socket in here. We're going to need our messages. Eventually, we need to add this to our socket object. We need to add messages to our context. We're going to need room ID. And we're going to want our username. So we can say if not room ID, then we're just going to return an empty div. So let's add our messages object to context. Grab these two properties here. We can pass these into value. We're going to copy username and set username. And this is going to be messages. It's just going to be equal to an array for now. So let's just say array of any. And we'll type this properly later, and same as rooms. So let's just say messages is equal to an empty object for now. And again, set messages is just going to be this function that returns false. Let's just create a div. And we can just map through our messages. We can just say p, and this is just going to be a JSON.stringify version of our message. And because we don't have anything else to identify this message by, we can use our index, and our index can be the key. So you can add an ID with nano ID to the message if you like, and then that can be the key for this, and that would be a little bit more reliable. So the next thing to do would be to send a message. So let's create some input to create the message. So I'm going to just create a new div here, and I'm going to create a text area. And our text area is just going to have rows equal to 1. We're going to have a placeholder of tell us what you are thinking. We're going to have a ref, get that ref in a minute. And then we are going to have a button, and the button is just going to say send. And our on-click handler is going to be handle send message. So let's create this ref. We'll say const new message ref is equal to use ref. Again, that's going to be null. Copy that new ref and pass it into here. Let's create this handle send message. So in here, we can say const message equals new message ref dot current dot value. And again, we can say if the message is equal to an empty string, we just want to return. So we'll say if not, and we'll cast it to a string dot trim, because again, we don't want any spaces to count. And then we're just going to return. Otherwise, we want to emit a new event. So we can say socket.emit events.client.send room message. We're going to pass in the room ID, and we're going to pass in the message. And we can also pass in this user's username. So let's create this event. Come back to events, and it's going to be in the client. You can say new message is equal to string. So because when we create a new message, we're going to broadcast the new message back out to everybody else. But broadcast won't emit to this client here that sent the message. So we have two options. We can either emit a new event just for them, or we can manually set this new message in the messages object. So if you're going to add an ID to the messages, you'll want to emit it out to the client, but I'm just going to use the set messages function and add a new message. So I'm going to get set messages from our use sockets. I'm going to call set messages, and it's going to be equal to a new array, and I'm going to spread all of our current messages onto the array. And then I'm going to add a new message object. So this message object needs to match whatever the server is going to broadcast back out to everybody else. So I'm going to have a username, and this username I'm just going to set to you, so the person knows that they're the one who sent this message. We're going to have the message. So this is the message body. And we're going to have a time that the message was sent, so we can display a timestamp. And so we're going to use date.getHours and date.getMinutes. So to make sure that both of those are consistent, let's create a new date object up here. So we can open our templating strings, and we can say date.getHours. Execute that function. We're going to put a full colon here. We're going to open up some new brackets. We're going to say date.getMinutes, and we can execute that as well. So let's handle this send room message function on the. We can collapse this here, and we can add a little comment here that just says when a user creates a new room. And we can add another comment here. And this is going to be when a user sends a room message. So we're going to socket.on events.client.send create room. So we need to copy our events object because this includes our send room message. On send room message, again, we're going to have a callback. And if we have a look here at what we're sending in, so we're putting our room ID, a message, and a username. So let's deconstruct that in the callback arguments, room ID, message, and username. So we're going to create a new timestamp. So again, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to say const date. And then we're going to emit a new message, and it's pretty much what the body of this message is. So we're going to say socket.to, and we're going to emit it to the room ID that the user is in. And we're going to say .emit. We say events.server.room message. So we need to add this room message to the server object. So we're going to include the message. We're going to include the username. And we're also going to include the time. So let's just copy our time from here. Pop that in there. So we need to handle this event here on the client. So let's come back and grab our events object, and we'll pass this into our client's events object. So down here where we're listening for events, we can say socket.on events.server.room message. Again, we can deconstruct the arguments in the callback. So if we have a look down here, we can see what arguments we're passing in. We're passing in a message, a username, and a time. So to handle this event, we want to set messages. Message is going to be equal to a new array. We want to spread all the current messages that we have. And we want to pass these values in here. So we can just copy and paste these. We're going to create a new object and pass them in. So let's type out our messages object. So we know we have a message, a username, and a time. And up here, we just have an array of any. So we can say this is going to be an array of a message. It's going to be a string. A time is going to be a string. And the username is going to be a string. So if we come back into our messages, where we're mapping through our messages, we can, instead of just stringifying this, we can say we want to make this the message. And instead of doing message.message, we can just deconstruct message in this argument here. So let's go back to our client and test this out. In our username, start, we're going to enter a room. So call this new room. Tell us what you're thinking. Hello. And you can see our hello message appears here. So let's open a new browser window and test that this is working. So we should expect everybody in that room to get that message. So we'll say this is John Doe. John Doe is going to create a new room called John's room. And see, we get John's room here, but we can't join that room. So let's turn this into a button so we can join John Doe's room. So come back to our rooms container. You can see here we're listing out all the rooms. So we're going to need a handler for joining a room. We'll say function handle join room. And this is going to take a room's key, which is the room's ID. And we can say if the key equals the current room ID. So this means they've clicked join on a room that they're already in. We're just going to return. We don't want to do anything. Otherwise, we're going to socket.emit. We're going to emit a new event. .client.join room. And we're going to pass in the key in here. It would be join room. So we need to add this event to our events in client. So down where we're mapping over our rooms, let's turn these into buttons. We'll wrap this in a button. We'll put the room name as the body of the button. So we're going to disable this button if the key equals room ID. The title of the button is just going to be join the room name in here. The on-click handler is going to be equal to a callback, and it's going to execute handle join room. And we're going to pass our key. So let's handle this join room on the server. Come back over to a server, and we can collapse all these functions. We'll add a new comment here that says, when a user joins a room, we'll say socket.on. We can copy this here. We need to copy our events object. Pass in a callback here. And if we have a look what this is sending us, just sending us a room ID. So we can call this room ID. Let's say sockets.join. And we're going to join that room ID. And then we're going to emit a new event. And the event that we're going to emit is this one here, where they have joined a room. So we'll say socket.emit events.server.joined room. We're going to reuse that event. And we can pass that down here. Go back to our client and we'll refresh both these pages. And this time we'll call this one left. Call this one right. We'll call this left's room. Okay, we get that room on both sides. Left is already in the room. We can join it on the right. We say hello from the left. Send that message and we get it here. And we can say hello from the right. So this looks good. When you want to see what is being sent from the server via sockets, you can come into the network tab, click on WS, which stands for WebSockets. And we'll send a new event here. So we'll say send. And we don't have anything here because we cleared them out. So you can see here that we now have our events object and all the messages are just going to appear on here. We can say Tom. And then we'll create a new room. And you can see here that we get our messages. So we get our joined room event, and this is the event here, and then we get an argument. So use this tab if you want to see what is being sent and received. So when I send a message, it should clear the message input. So let's go do that. So we have a handle send message. So we want to say new message ref.current.value is just going to be equal to an empty string. And that works. So if we don't have this tab in focus, we want the tab name to change when we receive a new message. Let's go do that. And this is going to be in our sockets.context. And so when we receive a new room message, we can use this web API called document.hasFocus. So we can say if not document.hasFocus, we can say document.title is equal to new message ... And then when we click back on the tab, we want to give the document focus again. So let's add an event handler for that, and we can use effect. And we can add a window.onFocus is equal to a function. And the function is just going to say document.title and make this our default title chat app. And we're going to pass an empty array. Go test this out. Remove focus. The new message, and we see we get our new message here, and then we click back into the tab and we get our app title back. So if we come back and we refresh, you'll notice that our username box is empty, but we want to be able to store this username in local storage so the user can just click start and they don't have to type their username in every time. So I've come over to application, and we can see that we have it set here. So the username is set to right. We just need to fill this box in. Come back over to our index. And so we want to create a use effect here. And we'll pass an empty array into the second argument. And we'll say username ref.current.value is going to be equal to local storage .get item. And the item that we're going to get is username. Or we're just going to set it as an empty string. Awesome. So let's go back and test this. And you can see that they both get set to right because that is what is in local storage. So we just want to add a little test here that says if username ref, then do this. So I think the next thing to do would be to start styling our application. So if we have a look at the screenshots of what it should look like, we have a nice background here and we have a box for the username. And then we have the same background. We have our rooms on the left here. And then we have our messages here. So let's go ahead and add our background image. So I'm going to come into client and we're going to serve our image from our public directory. So I just got this image from Unsplash. You can go choose your own image or you can use this one. I'm going to come into our styles and in global.css. I'm going to add our image to the body element. So it's going to appear on every page. So background image equal to URL. And it's going to load from our public directory. So I can just say bg.jpg. And I'm going to do background position is going to be center. Background repeat is going to be no repeat. And background size is going to be cover. And I'm going to make our body equal to 100% of the viewport height. And you can see here that we have a nice background image. So let's split our windows so we can see a live update as we update our styles. So the next thing to do would be to put this window in the middle. So we can come into our home.module.css and you can see that Next.js has given us a bunch of styles here and we pretty much want to remove all of these. And let's go fix up our markup and then we can add our classes to that markup. So you can see we already have our styles.username wrapper. We have our username inner. And we have our container. We can add all these styles to our home module. And these are some styles that I prepared earlier. You can copy and paste these from the GitHub repository, but I don't think you want me to explain every single CSS property. If you do, let me know. So we want to make our button purple. So we want to make all buttons that are call to actions purple. So let's add a class to that button. And we'll just call this CTA. And then we can do this in our global styles. We'll say button.cta is going to have a background color of blue violet, going to be white space, no wrap. Let's also make the color white and the border. Let's also make the cursor a pointer. And finally, we just need a little bit of a border radius. But I think this is going to apply to all buttons. So let's come up here and we can say button. And we can move our color property up to all buttons. Again, with our border and cursor. We're going to add a little bit of padding of 0.05 rem. And we're going to add our border radius of 4 pixels. So that looks good. We can click into here and let's go style our room column. So let's open up our rooms container. And again, we need to fix the markup in here first. So on our nav, we can add styles. So on our nav, we can add class name is equal to styles.wrapper. So you can call these whatever you like. They can be quite generic because the styles aren't going to bleed over into other modules. So we're going to add a new module here for our room container. The inside styles, let's add one called room.module.css. And we can import this from our styles module. So we'll call this style from, and this is going to be imported from styles / room module.css. So inside of our create room, we're going to add another class name. And this is going to be styles.create room wrapper. And our button is going to be a call to action. So let's give this a class name of CTA. And you can see that that goes purple and it gets the white text. So when we list out our rooms, let's wrap this in an unordered list. And I'm going to give this a class name. Equal to styles.roomList. So let's go add the styles for this. And this will give us a nice background color. It gives us a little border on the right. And it makes the whole thing a max width of 250 pixels. So let's create a room, call this new room. You can see we get a new room here. We get our message input. Let's send a message and we get a message there. So we want to now style our messages container. Come over to messages. And again, we need to fix up our markup and add some class names. So I'm going to add a new class name. And I'm going to just call this styles.wrapper again. And so we need to make a new styles module for our messages. So in the styles folder, we'll create a new file called messages.style.module.css. We can import that style module, import styles from styles /messages.module.css. So we want to wrap our messages in another class here. And we're going to call this message list. And each individual message, we want to wrap that in classes as well. I'm going to add a div here with a class name equals styles.message. Need to close this div. And because now this is our outermost object, we need to move the key. We can move that up a level. Let's add a new div and we'll call this message inner. And so we want to add some metadata above the image. Let's come back to our screenshot and we can have a look and see what this looks like. So you can see here above it, we have the name of the sender and the time. So we're going to add a little span. And inside the span, we can add our message.username. And then we can add a dash. So this isn't message.username because we are deconstructing our message up above. We can just have username in here. And we also need time. We can pass our time here. And we'll give this a class name is equal to styles.message sender. And we're just going to change this from a P to a span. And this is going to have a class name equal to styles.message body. So let's wrap this in a class as well. So we're going to say class name equals styles.message box. And we can go add our styles to this messages as well. So let's test this out. Click start, create a new room. So you can see here we have one little problem. When you create a room, it will broadcast all the rooms for us. But that room should appear here before we create a new room. I'll fix that in a second. So we can type a new message and we get our message here. And this all looks pretty good. So let's fix this problem here where when we connect, we get a new list of rooms. I'm going to close this for now. And I'm going to come back into sockets on the server. So once we're back in sockets on connection, we can emit a new event to the user. And we're just going to say socket.emit. And this is going to be events.server.rooms. And we're going to emit the rooms to the user. So because our server is restarted and we're storing our rooms in memory, we're not going to have any rooms. But we can refresh this and we can click start my window again. So in here, I'll create a new room. And so we get our room over here and that looks good. When we refresh this window, click start, we have our room here again. So when we send a message, send a really long message, more really long messages. You can see here we have a nice scroll window inside the message box. But the problem is we want this to scroll to the bottom when we receive a new message. So let's go and fix that. So if we come back into our messages, at the bottom of our message list, we want to add a new div. So we can add a new div and it's a self-closing div. And we're going to give it a ref of message end ref. And we can come up the top and we can create this ref. So const message end ref equals use ref, going to be equal to null. And then when we receive a new message, we want to scroll to the bottom of that view. So we're going to use effect, give it a callback. It's going to have a dependency on messages. And then we're going to say message end ref dot current. A question mark here because it could be undefined. I'm going to say scroll into view, and the behavior is going to be equal to smooth. So this is going to scroll smoothly. Give this a shot. You can see that it already scrolled. So let's copy this message, send that, and you can see that it scrolls into view. So let's test this out, and we're going to click into this room, say hello, and we get hello down the bottom here, and it scrolls into view. You'll notice that we have all the messages on this side, but because we only joined after these messages were sent, we don't have those messages on this side. You can persist those messages in the room object if you like, and then with the room, you can emit all the messages. So that is how to create a real-time chat application with React, Node.js, and Socket.io. If you liked the video, please make sure you smash that like button and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.